There is a peculiar irony in American political life. The very institutions that once insisted with great gravity that secrecy was essential to protect the integrity of investigations are now rushing, almost stumbling toward transparency the moment a new statute makes continued secrecy untenable. And nowhere is that irony sharper than in the Justice Department's sudden eagerness to unseal grand jury materials in the Jeffrey Epstein-Ghislaine Maxwell saga. For 6 long years, we were told that releasing anything, emails, logs, visitor records, grand jury transcripts, would jeopardize national security, violate privacy, undermine ongoing reviews, or reopen painful wounds. Yet the moment President Donald Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act, the departmental posture flipped almost overnight from "we can't" to "how fast would you like them?" This newfound urgency is not organic, it is statutory. The law, signed on November 19, places Attorney General Pam Bondi under a hard 30-day deadline. That means excuses, foot-dragging, and bureaucratic evasion are suddenly off the table. And to watch those gears shift tells us something about the nature of bureaucratic power in Washington. Transparency is never granted out of benevolence, it is extracted. The same agency that once insisted grand jury secrecy was inviolable now argues that Congress has directly overridden Rule 6A of the Federal Rules of Criminal Procedure. That is not a trivial claim. It means the political branches have stepped in and said, in effect, that the moral rot surrounding the Epstein affair has metastasized so deeply that normal legal protections no longer apply. And when Congress votes overwhelmingly 421 to 1 inch the House, unanimous consent in the Senate to make that point, you are looking at a rare moment when suspicion, distrust, and national embarrassment forge an unlikely unity. What fascinates me here is not merely the legal mechanics, but the cultural mood they reveal. A country convinced, rightly or wrongly, that a vast and shadowy network of elites protected Epstein for decades is no longer willing to accept the permanent sealing of anything. The blanket of secrecy that once insulated dozens, perhaps hundreds, of powerful individuals became intolerable, and the demand for disclosure crossed ideological lines. Thomas Massey and Ro Khanna do not agree on much, but on this they found common cause. Sunlight, even delayed sunlight, is better than another generation of euphemisms and sealed envelopes. Yet the moment the statute passed, the very people who lectured Americans about the sacredness of grand jury secrecy began asking the judge to expedite the release of transcripts they fought to hide earlier. We suddenly hear about the public interest. We hear about the need to modify protective orders. We hear that Congress has explicitly authorized disclosure. It raises a simple question. If Congress had not acted, if the pressure had not mounted, would any of these materials ever have seen daylight? Epstein died in 2019 under circumstances still widely doubted. Ghislaine Maxwell is serving her sentence far from the media glare, and yet the story refuses to leave. It lingers precisely because the custodians of the truth, inside and outside government, failed for years to handle the case with basic credibility. Had this been an ordinary criminal case with ordinary defendants, there would have been no need for sweeping new legislation compelling disclosure. The very existence of such a law is an indictment not of Donald Trump, as some hoped, but of a political and legal ecosystem that allowed a predator to operate for decades while elites circulated through his orbit without scrutiny. And this brings us to the deeper issue, the bipartisan, almost primal public hunger to know who exactly was aided, protected, compromised, manipulated, or embarrassed by their association with Epstein. Some of this is prurient curiosity, but much of it is rooted in something older and more serious, a suspicion that America's ruling class has operated under a separate moral code, shielded from consequences that would destroy the lives of ordinary citizens. When the single no vote in the House argues that releasing the files would injure thousands of innocent people, witnesses, family members, alibi givers, you can hear echoes of the old argument for secrecy. the paternalistic notion that exposure is more dangerous than corruption. But that argument collapses under the weight of history. Secrecy did not protect the innocent, it protected the powerful, and it did so for far too long. Trump signed the bill amid renewed scrutiny of his own past interactions with Epstein. Critics expected panic, resistance, or evasion. Instead, the opposite occurred. He instructed Congress to pass the measure, claimed he had nothing to hide, and then insisted the files be released. Whatever one thinks of Trump, this is not the behavior of a man worried about what unsealing will reveal. And indeed, early indications suggest that while Epstein referenced Trump occasionally as he referenced many public figures, the documents contain no allegation of misconduct. That is the great irony. The man whom political opponents hope to tie to Epstein is the one who ultimately forced disclosure. The judge's briefing schedule, the requirement that victims be notified, the tight December deadlines, these are procedural steps, but they sit atop a much larger tectonic shift. For the first time in 2 decades, the architecture of secrecy around the Epstein saga is cracking not through leaks or rumor, but through a direct act of Congress backed by overwhelming bipartisan majorities. And that perhaps is the strangest development of all. Only when 2 presidents, one past, one president and 2 parties finally stop treating Epstein as a political weapon does the possibility of truth even begin to appear. What becomes most evident as we move from the political theater of congressional votes to the mechanics of unsealing is the quiet but unmistakable struggle now playing out inside the Justice Department itself. For years, DOJ, under both Democratic and Republican administrations, leaned on familiar institutional tropes, ongoing investigations, privacy protections, grand jury rules to justify holding back virtually every meaningful document connected to the Epstein-Maxwell cases. And suddenly, as if a switch had been flipped, the department is now in federal court arguing that Congress has expressly authorized the very disclosures DOJ long insisted were legally impossible. This abrupt shift is telling. It suggests that the issue was never really about legal constraints. It was about institutional preference, cultural insulation, and fear. Fear of exposing investigative failure stretching back to the early 2000s. Fear of revealing relationships between Epstein and figures across both the political and financial elite. Fear that the image of an impartial legal system would shatter further once the scope of Epstein's connections was laid bare. When institutions carry that kind of dread for 2 decades, they reach instinctively for the most protective veil available, grand jury secrecy, and once that veil is pierced by statute, their internal logic collapses. The Justice Department's filing offers a kind of bureaucratic confession. By asking the court to expedite the unsealing of transcripts and modify protective orders, DOJ is acknowledging that its previous objections were not rooted in some immovable principle. They were tactical. One could argue that DOJ is merely following new law, and technically it is. But the speed with which the department now tries to meet the deadline reveals that the only thing ever missing was a political command backed by overwhelming congressional consensus. This raises a deeper question. Why did Congress act now, at this moment, after years of deflections, leaks, and speculation? One answer is generational. Epstein's death in 2019 created a lingering void of trust. Both the official explanation, suicide, and the surrounding circumstances were viewed skeptically by a significant portion of the country. Whether or not those suspicions were justified is beside the point. The institutional response to that skepticism was defensive and opaque. Many Americans watched a system close ranks rather than investigate itself. The same FISA courts, intelligence agencies, and federal prosecutors who had lost credibility during politically charged investigations into Trump now insisted that the Epstein files were too sensitive for public view. That dynamic created a bipartisan appetite for disclosure. Massey and Khanna did not join forces because they share some philosophical vision for transparency. They represent mirror-image constituencies that no longer believe their institutions will police themselves. The overwhelming vote reflects a national exasperation. Americans came to believe that if the government could classify the origins of a pandemic, the details of a border crisis, or the internal workings of intelligence abuses, it could certainly bury the connections of a predatory financier whose influence worked through private jets, private islands, and private favors. In that sense, Epstein became more than a criminal case. He became a referendum on whether the American elite, political, academic, financial, philanthropic, operates by a different set of rules. This is why the argument from Clay Higgins that thousands of innocent people might be harmed sounded so familiar. It was the same argument used to justify withholding the names of donors, the names of foreign contacts, the names of intelligence assets improperly used for political ends. In every case, we hear the same refrain: transparency will cause collateral damage. The public cannot distinguish context. Secrecy protects the innocent. But the public long ago stopped believing that. They suspect, and in many cases rightly, that secrecy protects the powerful far more often than the blameless. It is also telling that the judge overseeing the Maxwell case immediately acknowledged the statutory deadline. Judicial reluctance evaporates the moment Congress says this is no longer optional. The court's decision to notify victims and request their input is appropriate, necessary, and humane. Yet even that step highlights the core problem. Victims have waited decades for justice. Many of the individuals whose privacy concerns are raised today are the same ones who were never adequately protected when the crimes were occurring. Bureaucratic sensitivity at the 11th hour does not erase institutional neglect earlier on. Then there is the matter of Trump's involvement, or rather the lack of involvement. Critics expected, even hoped, that the unsealing would reveal something explosive tying Trump to Epstein's criminal operations. What has emerged instead is a handful of peripheral references, social encounters in the 1990s, acquaintanceship common among Manhattan elites, and scattered mentions with no allegations of misconduct. And yet the narrative persisted for years that Trump was hiding something. That narrative now dissolves under the weight of legal documents that show nothing of substance. This creates an awkward symmetry. The very law intended to force transparency was signed by the one figure opponents claimed feared transparency most. Meanwhile, the Biden administration's DOJ had 4 full years to release these materials and never did. Not a single file, not a single page, not a single voluntary disclosure. Only when compelled by Trump's signature and Congress's mandate did the machinery finally start to move. That is a political fact, not a partisan accusation. The public sees the imbalance clearly. When the FBI wants to leak portions of an investigation damaging to a political adversary, leaks appear within hours. When the DOJ wants to signal displeasure with a congressional inquiry, anonymous officials appear in the press warning of consequences. But when the issue concerns the deep failures surrounding the Epstein network, the government becomes strangely tongue-tied and inert. What the Epstein Files Transparency Act exposes more than anything is a decades-long pattern in which the Justice Department protects itself first, institutions second, and the truth last. The speed with which everything is now unfolding proves that transparency was never impossible. It was simply inconvenient. What becomes increasingly clear as we move deeper into the implications of this forced transparency is that the Epstein case was never a single scandal. It was a series of nested scandals, each one protecting the next. There was the scandal of Epstein himself, a predatory figure who operated with impunity in the wealthiest zip codes in America, patronized by universities, foundations, think tanks, royalty, tech titans, and former presidents. There was the scandal of law enforcement institutions that failed to prosecute him effectively in 2006 and then negotiated an unprecedented sweetheart deal in 2008. There was the scandal of media outlets that dismissed or buried early reporting because the accused moved in elite social circles. And finally, there was the scandal of institutional self-preservation after his 2019 death, a moment when the system should have confronted the full scope of its failure, but instead tightened the walls even further. The Justice Department's attempt to unseal documents today under force of law and under deadline is occurring against this backdrop of compounded institutional embarrassment. In other words, the materials being unsealed now are not merely files. They are artifacts of how the American elite shielded itself across 3 decades. Each email, each visitor log, each financial transaction carries with it the ghost of decisions never made, questions never asked, and warnings never heeded. And that is precisely why the public is so invested in this release. They sense the scale, they sense the cross-institutional complicity. They sense that Epstein was not a lone aberration, but a symptom of a much deeper malfunction in the American meritocracy. An elite that talks endlessly about social justice, transparency, and accountability while living in a private world governed by exemptions and favors unavailable to the people they lecture. You can see this contrast in the way different officials responded to the push for disclosure. When critics imagined Trump as one of the figures who would resist unsealing, they projected onto him the behavior they had grown accustomed to from the bureaucratic class. They expected delay, obfuscation, legalistic hedging. Instead, they encountered something else entirely, a mandate for total disclosure, a public demand that the files be released, and a direct instruction to Congress to move the legislation. That inversion, Trump pushing for transparency while a decade of federal officials hid behind procedural rules, has destabilized the narrative that many hoped would guide the next election cycle. But there is a deeper dynamic at work. Epstein did not just cultivate powerful Democrats. He cultivated powerful people, period. And the fact that Rep. Clay Higgins, House Speaker Mike Johnson, and others raised concerns about innocent individuals reveals a genuine anxiety about collateral damage. Some of that anxiety is legitimate. Many names in Epstein's orbit were tangential pilots, household staff, extended relatives, financial professionals who never witnessed or participated in wrongdoing. But to use those individuals as a shield for withholding the records of those who did abuse their power, did travel to his properties, did benefit from his influence, and did maintain contact even after his conviction, is to invert justice entirely. The law as written is not careless. It explicitly protects victims' identities. It shields minors. It preserves classified material and anything relating to ongoing investigations. What it does not protect, and what the public no longer wants protected, are the reputations of adults who willingly associated with Epstein after he was a known S times X offender. That is the moral dividing line. And it is the reason Congress was willing to override grand jury secrecy rules that had stood since the 1940s. There is an additional irony here. For years, major media outlets framed Epstein as a creature of the political right because Donald Trump once appeared with him in photographs during the 1990s nightclub scene. They repeated this narrative despite the overwhelming weight of evidence showing Epstein's philanthropic and political alliances rested overwhelmingly with the academic left, the tech elite, and Democratic megadonors. The focus on Trump served as a convenient diversion. If the story could be framed as a partisan scandal, then its broader implications about elite corruption could be minimized. But the documents now being pried loose tell a very different story. They show a financier who cultivated the Harvard leadership class, the Clinton-era diplomatic circle, and the global progressive donor sphere far more aggressively than he ever courted Republican politicians. They show scientists, university deans, think tank officials, and hedge fund managers, many of whom continued their interactions with Epstein after his 2008 conviction, not before. That is why the anxiety now surrounding these disclosures is less about Trump, who cut ties with Epstein early, and far more about prominent figures in philanthropy, academia, and finance. You can see this anxiety in the ritual distancing already underway. Some of the individuals whose names appear in the initial unsealed batches are issuing preemptive statements trying to frame their interactions as purely financial, purely administrative, purely incidental. We met to discuss scientific grants. We met to discuss philanthropic donations. We met to discuss economic modeling. These explanations may well be true in many cases, but they also reveal the undertow of dread running through elite institutions. They know what the public will think. They know how easily the line between legitimate contact and moral compromise blurs when dealing with someone like Epstein. The sheer scale of this failure explains why the release of the files is being handled not as a routine administrative matter, but as a national psychological event. Every institution touched by Epstein, universities, major law firms, intelligence agencies, philanthropic foundations, the media knows that the unsealing will inevitably raise questions about its own conduct. And that is why the government is now parsing redactions with surgical precision, not to protect the truth, but to protect itself from the full exposure of its negligence. Even the way the court is sequencing this process, collecting victims' letters, scheduling responses, issuing public notices, reflects the recognition that this is not merely a criminal case, it is a reckoning with the failures of an elite class that believed it could manage massage and indefinitely contain a scandal too large to suppress, a reckoning with the collapse of public trust, a reckoning with the realization that some institutions cannot be reformed until their buried history is dragged, however reluctantly, into the light. And buried beneath all of this is the most unsettling realization of all. For years, the American people suspected the truth long before the government was willing to admit it. For all the talk about transparency, accountability, and restoring trust, the real test is what happens when the revelations begin to surface in earnest. The Justice Department, the courts, the media, the philanthropic class, and America's political elite will each be tempted to narrate the disclosures in ways that shield themselves. They will reduce everything to isolated incidents. They will insist that the worst offenders were outliers. They will claim that certain revelations are being taken out of context, misinterpreted, weaponized. They will warn that further scrutiny could damage institutions essential to national stability. But that is precisely the kind of logic that allowed Epstein to operate for so long. The logic of protecting the institution even at the cost of abandoning the truth. The logic of believing that the public cannot handle full disclosure. The logic of convincing oneself that secrecy is synonymous with prudence. No republic can endure that kind of moral reasoning without incurring long-term damage. And the damage, in this case, has already been done. One reason the country is so fractured today, so cynical, so distrustful, is because the citizen understands instinctively when the powerful do not live by the rules they impose on others. They see a criminal justice system that lectures about equality while cutting immunity deals for the politically connected. They see an intelligence apparatus that insists on secrecy even when that secrecy shields incompetence or malfeasance. They see elite networks that exchange favors across academia, media, finance, and politics while pretending to be neutral arbiters of public virtue. That discrepancy, that glaring double standard, hollowed out public trust long before Epstein ever boarded his first private jet. The coming unsealing will not repair that damage. It cannot. But it can do something else, confirm what millions already suspected, that the American elite was less a meritocracy than an insulated caste, one that relied on secrecy, deference, and institutional protection to avoid the consequences of its own choices. When people say the American elite failed in the Epstein case, they are not referring to a single decision or a single agency. They are describing an entire ecosystem that protected itself at every level. Prosecutors who cut deals, universities that accepted donations, journalists who avoided uncomfortable stories, intelligence agencies that preferred ambiguity, and politicians who circled around Epstein so frequently that his social calendar became an anthropological catalog of American influence. And now, when the law finally compels transparency, the reaction is not moral clarity but bureaucratic scramble. Judges request briefings. Agencies prepare redactions. Attorneys warn of privacy concerns. Public relations teams draft statements. This choreography, this last-ditch attempt to manage the fallout, is itself a reminder of how deeply entrenched the culture of protection has become. Yet amid this institutional defensiveness, something remarkable has occurred. The public has refused to be gaslit. They remember the sweetheart plea deal in 2008. They remember the non-prosecution agreement hidden from victims. They remember Epstein's nearly uninterrupted global travel after his first conviction. They remember the surveillance camera malfunction that conveniently coincided with his death. They remember the guards asleep at their posts, the broken bones in Epstein's neck, the inconsistencies in official statements. They remember the years of stonewalling from the very agencies now begging the courts to hurry. This collective memory, this accumulation of unanswered questions, is what drives the bipartisan pressure behind the new law. It is also why the public will not be satisfied with a sanitized version of the truth. And here we arrive at the core insight that defines the conclusion of this entire saga. Transparency is not a gift from the powerful, it is a demand from the governed. The elites who orbited Epstein for decades believed that reputations, institutions, and careers could be preserved by secrecy. But history teaches the opposite. Secrecy corrodes institutions. It invites conspiracy theories. It accelerates distrust. It transforms bureaucratic failures into national embarrassments. And it ensures that when the truth finally emerges, as it now must, it does so in the most destructive possible way. The unsealing of the Epstein files is not just a legal obligation. It is an act of national hygiene. The country cannot rebuild trust in its institutions until those institutions demonstrate they are capable of confronting the ugliest parts of their own history. And the Epstein saga is among the ugliest, precisely because it blends moral depravity with elite protection. Whether the coming disclosures reveal 5 disturbing names or 50 is almost incidental. The real message is that the era of deference is ending. The public no longer trusts institutional gatekeepers to decide what they can handle. The Justice Department no longer gets to hide behind procedural formalities. The intelligence community no longer gets to issue ambiguous statements about sources and methods. Academia no longer gets to bury donor lists. Media outlets no longer get to decide which scandals are serious and which are not. In some ways, this moment mirrors earlier eras in American history when corruption became too obvious, too pervasive, too costly to ignore, moments when the public forced the ruling class to confront itself. The Teapot Dome scandal, the Church Committee investigations, Watergate, each exposed not just wrongdoing but the structural incentives that made the wrongdoing possible. The Epstein files will perform the same function. They will reveal how power operates in the shadows, how friendships and donations buy silence, how elite networks close ranks when threatened, and how institutions erode when accountability becomes optional. And so the conclusion is both simple and tragic. Jeffrey Epstein is dead, but the system that enabled him for decades is very much alive. The unsealing of these documents will not cure that system, but it will expose it, and exposure is the first step toward renewal. A republic cannot survive on secrecy, exceptions, and conspiratorial whisper networks. It survives when the truth, however belated, overwhelms the protectors of illusion. That is why this moment matters. Not because the files will answer every question, but because they signal an end to the era in which America's most powerful institutions could bury their failures beneath the weight of their own authority. The public demanded the truth, Congress legislated it, and the executive branch is now compelled to deliver it. In that convergence lies the faint outline of accountability and perhaps, just perhaps, the first stirrings of institutional recovery.